The old paradigm of resource extraction and colonialism is really hanging on for dear life, in any way that they can. They don't want to change. If you stay within the frame of patriarchy and colonialism, you're kind of bound by what is available within that frame. But when you step into a frame of nonviolence and peaceful action, there comes a point where when you step outside the structures, anything can happen.
It's time to change the world. It's time for something better. We're telling the stories of people who are changing the world and how you can help. Our daily actions have a massive impact, so what will we do about it? We can remake the world, because guess what? We can. Hi everyone, I'm Nathan Gardner, and this is We Can Remake the World, a podcast about the people who are changing the world and how you can help. We're recording on the road today from Manchester, England. It feels so good to be traveling again and to be in some new scenery, to explore a new city. I hope many of us get to experience a sense of relief at the worst of the COVID pandemic being over. Here's the good news for today. First up, whaling is set to end permanently in Iceland next year. Whaling has been dwindling in the island country for some time, especially after recent data showed that the economic benefit of tourism, which comes to Iceland related to whale watching, was far greater than any benefit, economically or otherwise, to hunting and killing whales. In other words, keeping the whales alive is more beneficial than killing them. A local campaign in Iceland garnered 175,000 signatures, the largest signatures campaign in Iceland's history. All of the signatories saying they no longer supported whaling in Iceland, which led the country to choose to no longer renew any whaling permits once the ones that are already given expire in 2023, next year. Let's hope we see similar trends in countries who still participate in commercial whaling, such as Japan and Norway. If you want to learn more, check out the International Fund for Animal Welfare, which hosted the Iceland Signatures campaign. They're at ifaw.org. And our second piece of good news today comes to us from India. The Forest Survey of India recently reported that the world's second most populous nation had grown its national forest cover by over 500,000 acres. And that number factors in the loss of forests due to deforestation and logging. The country still grew its forest cover by this 500,000 acres. Tree planting has become a growing trend in India in recent years. In 2016, locals in the state of Uttar Pradesh planted 50 million trees in a single day, which set a new world record. And the following year, in 2017, volunteers in Madhya Pradesh, another state in India, planted 66 million trees in just 12 hours, which is the current world record for tree planting in a day. This comes at a time when many nations around the world are concerned about the loss of trees and the carbon that they absorb from the atmosphere. Forests are often called carbon sinks, and the burning or cutting down of those carbon sinks releases more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So it's a welcome piece of news. This is what I think is possible when large communities agree on shared values and then take action to express those values. This movement in India is growing, and we could see it grow around the world with more and more tree planting and conservation campaigns. And this is especially significant given our conversation today, which is all about protecting what we have before it's gone forever. History is repeating itself in Western Canada. Clayoquot Sound, off the west coast of Vancouver Island, which itself is just west of the Pacific coastline of mainland Canada, has become the epicenter of another major, globally important protest to protect local environments and ecosystems. Clayoquot Sound is historically a beautifully rich and very rare temperate rainforest ecosystem, home to thousands of species, many of which are endangered, and old-growth forests with some of the tallest and oldest trees on Earth. Beginning in the mid-20th century, this region was increasingly stripped of its ecosystems, specifically its trees, primarily by the logging industry, no surprise, with permission from the local government of the state of British Columbia, which continues to this day, this logging. Over 90% of the forests on Vancouver Island have been lost, and it's estimated that only 3% roughly of the old-growth forests are still intact. But these haven't been lost without fights along the way. The first stand for the forests of Clayoquot Sound began in 1984, when a large logging corporation was planning to cut the forests of Mears Island, which is in the region of Clayoquot Sound. The Nuu-Channel First Nations members and local activists came together to block the logging road. Joe Martin, an indigenous leader, said at the time, "It's the first time whites and natives have gotten together on anything that's worthwhile," as he and the fellow members of his nation declared Mears Island a tribal park and not available for private logging. This was the first time the idea of tribal parks entered the conversation, where a native community asserted its rights over its ancestral lands as far as stewardship and control. The logging company at that time successfully lobbied for an injunction to remove those protesters who were protecting the lands, who were blocking the logging roads. But in 1985, the local Ahusit and Clayoquot First Nations joined the Nuu-Channel First Nation. They came together as well and sought their own injunction to halt the logging until the courts could resolve this question of whose land was being logged. The British Columbia court system upheld the injunction brought by the First Nations, forcing logging operations to cease until a dialogue could start between First Nations, the government, and the corporations, leading to some kind of treaty which allowed controlled harvesting of the trees or something of the like. This was an important precedent set by the court system in British Columbia, which gave indigenous peoples the right to claim stewardship over their lands, at least until the court system could decide whether or not that was upheld legally. And this injunction has protected Mears Island and halted logging efforts to this day. But it did not protect the forests in the region around it, which have continued to be logged. 8 years later, after the government of British Columbia announced increased logging in Clayoquot Sound, after campaigning on a promise to protect the old-growth forests, therefore going against exactly what they had said in their campaign, the conversation again reached a flashpoint, which started with 35 protesters who came together to block logging roads, as had been done in the past, which over time grew into a national and international movement to protect these local ecosystems. Over the course of several months, over 12,000 people took part in the blockade, which prevented logging trucks from going into Clayoquot Sound, and almost 900 individuals were arrested throughout the summer of 1993, which became known in the media as the War in the Woods. Leave it to the media to turn everything into a war of some kind, but that's what it came to be known as. There were several outcomes to this protest movement, including a global conversation that was started around the use of products containing old-growth paper, with major publishers in the US and Canada committing not to purchasing paper products from old-growth forests. Companies in Germany joined that conversation as well, and committed to no longer purchasing paper made from old-growth forests. Many logging companies pulled out of Clayoquot Sound over PR concerns, and the company who was pursuing the logging at the time, Macmillan Bledel, lost over $200 million in contracts as a result of the controversy surrounding their efforts in Clayoquot Sound and the activist movement to stop it. In the year 2000, the entire sound was designated as a UNESCO biosphere region, which I think many believe came out of the attention that this region received from these protests. Unfortunately, that designation does not prevent logging in the region, though. In 2006, a new plan was approved to proceed a further 90,000 hectares into the forests of Vancouver Island, which included old-growth valleys. So, the fight continues, literally to this day. The most recent movement to save the forests of Clayoquot Sound began very recently, this time centered around the Fairy Creek watershed, a specific valley with old-growth trees on Vancouver Island, undisturbed from logging efforts, which has disrupted so many ecosystems in the area. Fairy Creek boasts some of the largest trees in the world, including the planet's tallest Douglas fir and Canada's largest Sitka spruce. This specific area is home to an extensive list of endangered species, including species of owls, frogs, small mammals, multiple birds, and hawks, but the government of British Columbia had granted the Teal Jones Logging Company, which is the largest private logger in British Columbia, the right to cut down about 32 acres of old-growth forest in this valley. Local activists and concerned citizens and members of indigenous nations took notice and decided to make a stand. Beginning primarily with the activist group the Rainforest Flying Squad, leading efforts on the ground, activists and local community members came together to blockade, yet again, the logging roads and operations in this area. They began chaining themselves to the ground, chaining themselves to trees, and they were joined by members of the local indigenous nations, including one named Katie George Jim, who has asserted on record that the police, courts, and industry in British Columbia have no jurisdiction over these lands, as they are unceded by the indigenous peoples. These peoples never gave up the rights to their lands, which we'll speak about in our interview in a bit. As of last week, in mid-February, 1,188 individuals have already been arrested by Royal Canadian Mounted Police due to an injunction which allows the government law enforcement to step in to protect the interests of the Teal Jones Logging Company. Due to documented violence from the police, including pepper spraying protesters, forcibly removing their COVID masks and spraying them full-on in the face, and violently removing them from various areas which impact the logging operations, the injunction which allowed the police to step in was overturned by British Columbia Judge Douglas Thompson, who believed that the actions of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were unjustified and that the injunction was no longer enforceable. But the Court of Appeals in British Columbia, which is a panel of judges, just a few weeks ago reinstated the injunction, which means the police will be back and the protesters also will be back, continuing this struggle to protect the local ecosystems. The injunction is currently set to last until September of 2022. And the protesters have already been saying they'll be ready to resume blockades and peaceful resistance as the snow melts and spring begins to prevent hundreds of acres of old-growth forests from being destroyed forever, which is already happening. 475 acres have already been cut in 2021. This is the largest demonstration of civil disobedience in Canadian history here at Fairy Creek, happening right now, built on the foundation of the movements in Clayoquot Sound before it. But this time, the logging companies and the government are not demurring from the controversy. They want to win. And if you believe the reports from activists on the ground who were at both Clayoquot Sound in 1993 and at Fairy Creek this year and in 2021, police and government tactics are becoming increasingly aggressive. But the protesters remain peaceful and their fight continues. What I'm most interested in is what we can learn from these movements. Are they an effective means to making change? If protecting the environment is our goal, what's the best way to get there? When it's so obvious that corporations and governments are basically just giving us lip service and not following through on commitments to protection and conservation. If this is our best method, how do we replicate the ones that have worked? How do we actually create change on the ground? I think this is such an important question to be asking this year. Is activism and direct action our best option, our only option, to effectively confront these governments and corporations who talk a big game around green efforts and protection of natural resources and the rights of people and planet, but who carry out a very different ethos in how they behave, who go back on their word? What do concerned citizens in a distressing world do to make their voices heard and block efforts to undermine the health of the earth and of people? Today we speak with Bonny Glambeck, co-founder and campaigns director of Clayoquot Action, a grassroots ecological advocacy and direct action organization in Clayoquot Sound. A native of Ontario, Bonny was one of the original 35 people who was there on the ground in 1993, building the movement to protect the old-growth forests in her region. That movement, which grew to 12,000 across Canada, coming to Clayoquot Sound to join the protest. Over the past 29 years, Bonny has continued her work to protect this beautiful and precious region in Western Canada in cooperation and collaboration with the indigenous First Nations communities in the area. Bonny shares why she believes the most powerful tool we have is peaceful, nonviolent, direct action, and what she's learned as an activist with over 3 decades of experience in difficult David versus Goliath type movements to protect the natural world from exploitation by corporate interests who are often enabled by government. Bonny reminds us that we all have a choice to stand up and protect what we love. Perfect. So today we're joined by Bonny Glambeck, campaigns director for Clayoquot Action. Thanks so much for joining us today, Bonny. Really nice to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited to dive in. I think there's a lot of really great stuff to cover. So first, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with an introduction for Clayoquot Action, sort of where you're located and what you focus on as far as your mission and your work.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're located in Canada on the very, very west coast of Vancouver Island, and in a village called Tofino, in a region called Clayoquot Sound. And Clayoquot Sound is a UNESCO biosphere region, so it's a very important ecological, it's globally important in terms of the ecology of our region. So that's where we're based, and I actually live on a little island just across from Tofino. So that's where we're broadcasting from today. And Clayoquot Action, we are a community-based organization that works to conserve the biocultural diversity of Clayoquot Sound. And so what that looks like right now is we're working to protect the wild salmon of Clayoquot Sound because they are so important to the ecology of this region, as well as to the culture of this region and the West Coast. And we do our work through education, through research, citizen science, and advocacy.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear more about all elements of what you just shared. I think I'd like to start, though, with a little bit more about Clayoquot Sound. I've seen photos, and I mean, it's just breathtaking. I'd love to hear you speak about what makes that part of the world special for those of us who haven't visited, and why it's so important to conserve the resources there from many perspectives, you know, ecologically as well as because of the indigenous communities, which are very much connected to it, and citizens like yourself. You know, what makes Clayoquot Sound so special?
Well, I think one of the things is that geographically we're in a really great location for the old growth forest, the growth of the old growth forest. We just have the perfect climate. It's not too cold. There's pretty rich soils here. Not rich soils, but the salmon actually feed the soils. But the climate and geography is really good for the old growth forest. So it has really grown into an amazing thing since the last ice age. And there hasn't been any disruption of this forest since the last ice age. Because we don't have fires. They're not a natural part of the ecosystem here because we get a lot of rain. We get about 4 meters of rain every year.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of rain.
Yeah.
And and you know, it's very special for those reasons, but it's also special because it's so rare. All of the BC coast, much of the BC coast has been logged. Vancouver Island itself is about over 90% logged. So there's very few areas left that have large intact rainforest valleys. There's been a bit of protection in British Columbia for individual valleys, but one of the special things here is that we have a number of large valleys in the backcountry that have never been logged, and so you've got this huge contiguous area of undisturbed natural area, and so that's really special. And the reason why it's still like that is because in the mid 80s, First Nations and local people realized that this area was about to be clear-cut logged, like much of the rest of the island and the BC coast had already been logged. And so they started a protest on Mears Island and blocked the loggers from coming to shore and starting their road building. And that was in about 1984. And then the Clayoquot First Nation went to court and won an injunction against the logging company, which was groundbreaking. And the judge basically said that until the land question was settled, the company couldn't go ahead and log Mears Island. So that was the beginning of a new era in British Columbia.
I'd love to hear more about that, but I also think that there's something worth calling out, which I learned as I was getting ready to speak with you today, that in Canada, at least in Western Canada as I understand it, the First Nations or indigenous communities have never formally turned over, so to speak, their lands. There were no treaties, there have been no battles fought, or there's been no formal changeover of these lands. So I didn't know that, and I would imagine it creates both an empowering situation for the indigenous communities from a legal perspective, but also a very complex interplay between these interests. And I'd love to hear you speak about that, if you would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's what's called it's called unceded land. So the tribes, the nations within British Columbia have never signed treaties with any government. And so they have consistently put forward the message to whatever government of the day for, hundreds of years that this is their land and they've never given it up. They've never lost it in war. And the Mears Island case was one of the first to really bring this into the forefront. And it's caused, it does cause a real area of conflict because our government is, we're all about resource extraction, and so they're always coming up against the First Nations rights, and they keep going back to court to try to establish whose land it is, but the court is very clear that the First Nations have rights to their land and have the right to have input on what's happening. But it still remains a very gray area in terms of how the government is dealing with First Nations issues. And we see that in Fairy Creek, which is another old growth area that's been a real point of conflict over the last couple of years, where, the government tends to want to go in and co-opt the First Nations and try to sort of bring them into the extraction fold and entice them with revenues and monies to get them to go ahead and destroy their very territories. And that's been a tactic that's been used quite a bit over the last couple of decades.
And I mean, in Canada, I think resource extraction is a huge conversation. Of course, it's a huge conversation around the world, but I think logging is a big issue. It's a big question in a lot of Canada. To your knowledge, are there other First Nations across the nation outside of the Vancouver Island area, the West Coast area, which are also having these same conversations? Is this sort of a nationwide conversation?
Oh, it's very much a nationwide conversation. Very much across British Columbia and across Canada, this idea of First Nations ownership of the land is very much at the forefront. And as Canadians, we're really grappling with it. Our government is grappling with it, trying to find a way forward. But I really feel it could, grappling with it in a good way could really force us into a better paradigm. But the old paradigm of resource extraction and colonialism is really hanging on for dear life, in any way that they can. They don't want to change.
No, absolutely. I feel like we see right now in the world this sort of major cry from the colonialist mindset, which is just trying to get as much as it can as our minds start to change, as our understanding of how the world could be is shifting. It seems like those interests are, giving it all they've got because they feel that their hold on sort of the persuasiveness of that argument is falling away. At least that's my hope, I guess. I would say.
And First Nations have, in our region and beyond, they've been forced into an economic corner with all that's happened, all the damage and abuse that's happened through residential schools and, all of the colonial damage that's been done. The economies on the reserves and in the villages is very poor, and many people live in poverty. And so when it comes down to a large corporation coming and offering a lot of money to allow the continued damage to the land through extraction, it's really hard to say no, because you're dealing with what's looking like a long-term protection of your land, or, short-term, we need houses for our people, we need healthcare, we need education, and this type of thing. So it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, to be sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, to use that phrase, of colonialism is what has undermined your ability to provide in the first place, and then to have to go to that hand and accept a deal which will break your connection to something very I just can't imagine. But I think on the bright side, I think Canada is almost uniquely poised to hopefully be a launching pad for more Indigenous voices in leadership, as far as land stewardship, as far as part of the community of voices who are deciding the direction that we're taking. And I'm starting to see more and more stories of land being turned over to Native stewardship in the United States and in Canada, and wins from the Indigenous communities to speak up and speak out and really advocate for themselves, and they're being listened to and heard in a way that I think is more significant than anything I've seen in my lifetime. And I don't know if that's true for you as well.
I think that's really true. And what we see in the region here, and really in across BC as well, is that there's a tremendous amount of healing going on from the colonial damage. And, the next generations that are coming, already there's so many wonderful leaders who are really taking the nations in a good direction and in a more, traditional and stewardship of the land. These values are very important. So, I'm very hopeful right now for that.
That's great. That's great to hear. Would you share a bit more about how Clayoquot Action collaborates with the First Nations community members sort of in the Vancouver Island region, and sort of how their voices play into the work that you do?
Well, we work with First Nations to monitor the fish farms in our area. That's one of our main campaigns right now. So we work closely with one of the charter boat operators, and we do research and monitoring. And so we make that information available to First Nations, and we support through organization of direct actions and solidarity actions and volunteer opportunities for local peoples and that type of thing. So that's some of the main ways that we've been involved with the local First Nations.
Great. Would you speak a bit more, too, about some of the direct action that you take, that Clayoquot Action takes, as well as the local community members, and sort of some of the situation on the ground as far as the action that you're taking and the results that are taking shape?
Well, just depends how far you want to go back, but
I think there was this March, I saw in 1993 protests it was the biggest sort of civil disobedience in Canada, I think, right? And that happened in Clayoquot Sound.
It did, yeah. And as I mentioned, the things really got kicked off in the 80s, and that was very much led by the First Nations. And then there was kind of what's called the War in the Woods that took place through the late 80s and into the early 90s. And I came to Clayoquot Sound in 1988, and at that time there was a blockade going on a logging road, which I got involved with, and a Howsett First Nations hereditary chief, Earl George, was leading that when I arrived, and I got involved with that and ended up getting arrested with about 35 other people. And we managed to stop that road, but unfortunately myself and 6 other women were sent to maximum security prison at that time for peacefully demonstrating on that road.
Wow.
And I think the government
How did they justify that?
Well, I think the government of the day just really wanted to send a message to other protesters, I guess. Wow. But when I was around 25 when that happened, and it was a very eye-opening experience to be in prison.
How long did you serve?
Only for 6 days. Yeah.
Still, though.
But
yeah,
I never experienced anything like that, and to be, like a white environmentalist, middle class person choosing to go to jail. And we were in with a lot of indigenous women, and it was a real eye opener for me at that age to experience that. And I had been involved with the anti-nuclear movement and the feminist movement when I lived in Eastern Canada in Toronto, and when I moved here, I brought the idea of nonviolent direct action to like more of the philosophy. People were doing blockades, but it wasn't really kind of organized in a way that I had experienced in when I was in Toronto in the movements there. So I brought some of that philosophy and the feminist philosophy to the movement here. And at some point we realized like we can't stop the logging just by being 35 people at the end of a logging road in the middle of nowhere. So we decided to switch to a more Gandhian style of protest. So rather than doing things like hanging in hammocks and, tree houses and trying to stop the road blasting and the logging that way, we just tried to get masses of people and essentially to do conscientious objections. So they would block the logging road for the day, and they would be arrested, and the logging trucks would go through, which many people really didn't feel comfortable with that because the logging was continuing on. But there were some of us in the organizing group that really felt that if we were able to continue that and stick with that more and more people would come, and we would eventually make greater ripples than just stopping the logging for a day. And so we started doing that in 1992. And by 1993, the government announced that they were going to log 3/4 of Clayoquot Sound. There had been like a lot of planning and controversy and decision-making going on, but they finally made their decision and said they were going to log the whole thing. And that sparked this Clayoquot Summer 93, where there was about 10,000 people who came through a peace camp that we set up. And and all of them, people called it the Radical University because everybody who came there had to go through a nonviolence training, like a short afternoon thing. And we worked by consensus. We would have like 300 people in an evening circle, and we would decide by consensus what we were going to do. And it really actually worked quite well. Not that there wasn't conflict or, speed bumps along the way, but it was a really incredible experience for people to go through. And it was, the peace camp was a little bit away from where we were blockading. So people were able to stay in the peace camp, and those that wanted to go and support or be arrested could choose to go down and do that on any given day. So over the course of the summer, almost 1,000 people were arrested. And until Fairy Creek in this last summer, that was the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history up until just this last summer. And it had a profound effect here. Like here, it's meant that these big intact valleys that I've been talking about, they were never logged. They never actually turned them into parks or anything, but the companies never did go in and log them just because of the threat that, that this could happen again. So in that way, it was a really big success.
And this just started with 35 of you who were the sort of the originators of these actions, and then it grew to, wow.
Yeah. And wow. So it's quite an experience. And well, I mean, really, it started on Mears Island with those people taking action. That was really, where it started with the Clayoquot and Hausut First Nations. And but now our region is still not legally protected, but now it's at a stage where governments are working with First Nations to try to develop a conservancy, so not a park where people just can kind of go and visit, and like First Nations aren't allowed to go there and hunt or to gather food or do any traditional practices. They're looking at a model more along the lines of a conservancy where there can still be human use of the area by First Nations, but the area will be protected from industrial activity. So that's coming down the line soon, hopefully, for our region.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I would imagine that would be sort of hopefully a pioneering model that can be replicated elsewhere too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was used in the Great Bear Rainforest in the northern coast of British Columbia, the north central coast. That was the first place that they started looking at doing conservancies in partnership with First Nations. So it's quite a good model.
It raises an idea for me from a book that I've been reading, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which I've been talking about a lot. Actually, Sam, the filmmaker who I interviewed back in December who connected us, she recommended the book to me, and I'm so glad she did. And the author writes about this idea that, humans being removed from the land is not necessarily the best way to protect the land, that there's actually a symbiotic benefit to humans being part of the stewardship of land, of plants, of the animal populations. Taking humans out of the equation is not necessarily the answer. It's not really the healthiest choice in many ways. And so the idea of a conservancy rather than sort of this protected, museum of nature seems like a bit of an evolutionary step in our understanding of how to have these conversations appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Very much. Yeah, I love her writing and just the idea of reciprocity, like I think that I heard a First Nations man who his nation is from the Fraser River, and we were at a salmon conference, and he was talking about the idea that people are talking like the salmon runs in British Columbia are on the brink of extinction, and some First Nations who use salmon, as a subsistence food, it supplements their diet and obviously a very important part of their culture. And so there's a lot of discussion where the salmon runs are so low that nations are talking about not even harvesting because in respect for wanting to allow that to rebuild and to not totally wipe it out. But this man spoke about the idea that we have a responsibility, his nation had a responsibility to interact with the salmon and to go in the fall and to, it's part of that reciprocal relationship that Robin talks about in the book, that, going and singing the songs and praying and being aware of what's happening with the salmon, like it's that relationship that is so important. And that if you just say, well, we're not going to eat that and we're not going to harvest, it does change the makeup of the world, and yeah, and then the same thing with plants where, it's actually beneficial for some plants for us to come in and harvest certain areas so that the plant can regenerate and produce more. So we are part of the world, and I think it's one of the things that it's a bit of an issue within the environmental movement, and even beyond the environmental movement. Many people feel that humans are just a blight on the planet, and that once we're gone, nature will carry on and it'll all be okay. But I really feel like humans are part of nature, and that we really have to reconnect with that and I think there will be keys to our future and to our survival and the survival of nature as we know it through that relationship.
To remember our role as stewards, as the unique beings who can design, who can understand the systems well enough to support them rather than destroy them if we give ourselves the chance. And we can be part of facilitating this incredible renewal on a global scale if we choose to, And so conversations like the ones that, Robin Wall Kimmerer raises and everything we're speaking about, I think is part of that. And hopefully it will grow quickly. I know Clayoquot Action is very closely connected to the salmon and to that conversation that's really urgent at this point. And I'd love to hear you speak more about some of what's contributing to the challenges around the wild salmon and the health of that ecosystem and some of the players going on there.
Mm-hmm. So in our region, we have fish farms, the open net pen fish farms, and we have about 20 of them in Clayoquot Sound, and they place these farms right on the migration routes of the wild salmon. So the salmon life cycle is such that the salmon start their life in the rivers, and then they come out to the ocean and go out there's different species, so they might spend a different amount of time at sea growing into adults, and then they make their way back to the river that they started from. And each run is genetically unique and adapted to that particular river or stream and the conditions there. And so these farms, they put them right on the migration routes of the salmon. So the salmon, when they're coming and going from their home river, have to pass by these farms. And the farms are essentially open net pens, so they're large nets in the water that there's no barrier between them and the ocean. Like all of the ocean water just flushes through, and all the sewage from the fish drops down, and they use pesticides and antibiotics, and there's parasites and viruses and pathogens that grow on the farms because the farms are very, very crowded. It's like any industrial, I mean, just imagine like a pig farm or a cattle feedlot, but it's underwater. And so you have all the same animal health issues that you have when you crowd any animal into a pen like that. And the problem here is that when the wild salmon pass by those pens, they are exposed to pathogens and parasites and what other, pollutions that are coming out of the farms. And so those are the biggest challenges that our salmon here are facing right now. And of course, there are other challenges like habitat destruction or like from the logging, or also climate change, is obviously causing challenges for wild salmon. But this one is a particularly bad one, and it's also within our ability right now to change it quite quickly. Whereas with climate change, we have to work together with other nations to come to some kind of an agreement to reduce emissions, and even with that, we're still on a trajectory where we're going to go through some heavy changes here, and we're seeing that start to come into play more and more. But salmon farms is something that if our governments decided right now, today, that we wanted them out, we could get them out, and the fish would have a free passage through there. So the sea lice are particularly bad. They're like a type of parasite that latches onto the fish, and they are natural here in the ocean, but they proliferate on the farms, and they shed off of the farm, and as the wild baby salmon go by, they pick up a load of these sea lice on their way out to sea. And the fish are so tiny, they don't even have scales yet. And nature never intended them to meet up with sea lice at that stage of life. They're not supposed to, they don't normally, without the fish farms, they wouldn't get sea lice until they're adults, at which point they would only have a couple on them. But if a young salmon gets, it's like one sea lice per gram of salmon, but essentially 1 to 3 sea lice on a salmon is a fatal load for that young salmon. And right now in Clayoquot Sound, the fish farms are having an explosion of sea lice on their farms, and we're really concerned about the young salmon that are going to be coming out starting in March. They'll be leaving their home rivers. So we're really concerned about that. And then there's deadly viruses that have been imported from Norway, which is where these salmon originated. And the eggs were brought over to Canada, and this is how this Norwegian virus got into the farms here. And we did a study of all the farms in Clayoquot Sound and found that 99% of the farms had this virus that's deadly to wild salmon. So the wild salmon can pick it up as they pass the farm. So it's really, really causing a big impact on the wild salmon here. And so that's where we have focused our efforts in the last few years, is on, exposing how bad these farms are and working with First Nations here and with the government to try to get them out of the ocean as soon as possible.
And I think what's so important to highlight, which I've been learning as I've been reading Braiding Sweetgrass and also researching more about this region of Canada and learning more about this, is that it's not just wild salmon at stake, it's really the entire ecosystem, because the salmon are an integral part of this ecosystem for wildlife, for plant life, for the stability of the ecosystem, which then translates to stability of the climate, I'm sure, or microclimates, and of course for people, especially the First Nations people, but for everyone. If the economy is based at all on wild salmon and the harvesting or relationship to it, whether that's a local economy or a larger economy, there's a lot at stake here. It's
there
not
really
just
is.
The health of one species, it's the entire community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the salmon are known as they're called a keystone species. So that means that it's like the keystone in a doorway. If you pull it out, all the doorway will crumble. And that's what salmon are for this ecosystem. And I mentioned earlier, like our soils in the old growth forest are very shallow. but and nutrient poor. And so scientists for many years were wondering, how are these trees growing to monumental sizes? The trees here are, thousands of years old, and they're huge, huge, monumental Sitka spruce and cedar. And what the scientists figured out is that up to 80% of the nitrogen that's in the trees is coming from a marine source. And nitrogen, if you're any gardening listeners will know, nitrogen is a really key component for plants to grow. So these are nitrogen-poor soils, and where is this nitrogen coming from? It's coming back in the bodies of these salmon that return to the forest to spawn and start the next generation. So they spawn, and then things like bears and eagles and wolves come in and haul them out of the creek and spread that nitrogen around the forest floor. And so without that nitrogen input, these forests may not survive in the long term. And like you say, they are a very important carbon sink for, to help mitigate climate change, these large tracts of rainforest.
Right. What I think is so beautiful about what you just shared is that it's a unique, I think, aspect of our time on this planet, of when science can actually show us the factual evidence of interconnectedness, that science has reached a level of advancement so that they can say the nitrogen in these trees is coming from a marine source, which, sounds, if you don't think about it in a certain way, just, okay, great. But if you go to the interconnectedness lens, then it's proving that we are interconnected. Mm-hmm. And if we can take scientific data like that and allow it to inform how we move forward, I think it can really be an evidence-based, a science-based argument for the conservation of a lot of these species and ecosystems. And it proves what we know instinctually, that we're all here together and in this together. Mm-hmm. But hopefully arguments like that will help to, wake people up to these conversations and to the urgency of them.
Mm-hmm. So that's what, getting these farms out of Clayoquot Sound is something that we're really focusing on now. And there is hope that this may actually happen within the next maybe 3 years or so, I'm not sure. But our current federal government in Canada has made a promise that they'll remove open net pen farms from BC waters by 2025. And so it's already started to happen in one region within British Columbia, in the Broughton Islands, and also in the Discovery Islands it's starting to happen. So we're very hopeful that this will also happen in Clayoquot Sound and the rest of British Columbia. But it's a big push and pull between government and the industry and First Nations who have workers working on the farms. And as I mentioned earlier, these are important jobs, and there's revenues coming in from the farms. So it's a big push and pull between all the nations that want them and nations that don't want them and the government. But I'm hoping that the final outcome will be that we can get them out and see these salmon runs, survive and thrive into the future.
Yeah, I would hate to imagine the world in which that stops and what that means. Mm-hmm. And I hope very much that we don't have to experience it too. That raises an interesting question for me as far as what we were speaking about earlier. How could fish farms like this be built in the first place in, indigenous regions without consultation if these are unceded lands? How has the Canadian government and or industry been able to sort of ignore that question and take steps like this anyway?
Well, when they first came in, I think one thing is that most people didn't realize how bad they would be. Although apparently a Norwegian delegation came to the Canadian Parliament and warned them, because Norway's wild salmon has almost been completely wiped out by their fish farms industry. And it's a Norwegian industry that has come and set up here. So at that time in the 80s when these farms came, at that point governments weren't consulting with First Nations. It wasn't even on the radar. And if there was any question about it, nations were usually convinced to host these farms in their territories because of the economic imperative that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
And the current situation is that our provincial and federal governments are recognizing now that they need to consult. So this is becoming part of the landscape of resource extraction now. And the provincial government has said that as the licenses or the land tenures, they have a tenure over the ocean bottom, and as those come to be renewed, the provincial government will not renew them if the company does not have a protocol agreement or consent of the nation. So, these kind of ideas are starting to be built into our government processes. So, things are changing for the better in that way.
Good. Yeah. I hope to see that more in the United States as well, where I think the indigenous conversations are still, there's still a lot of development to happen there. And we should be hearing from indigenous voices so much more in all of these conversations. I think especially in the conservation and environmentalist conversation, we hear a lot from governments and from corporations about what they're doing, but we don't hear a lot from people at all, let alone indigenous peoples, as to whether or not that's the right path or if that's enough. There's very little consultation openly in a public forum about the best path forward, and certainly no consultation with indigenous communities that I've seen in a meaningful way in the United States yet. At least to my awareness. I hope that it's happening without my awareness, but I'd like to see more and I'd like to hear more. I wanted to ask about outcomes from the 1993 marches too, and sort of how you've seen action and direct action play into these conversations, and what you've learned from being part of these movements over time, as far as the power of people, the power of citizens, the power of community to come together to advocate for their values against huge organizations, including governments, and what you maybe have learned over your time in working with Clayoquot Action and others to accomplish what you have.
Well, I think one of the big things that comes to the fore is just the need to remain peaceful as a tactic. And that can look a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be, a passive, boring thing. I mean, if you want to learn more about that, your listeners can check out the Beautiful Trouble website. I don't know if you've ever had a look at that, but, there's so many ways to participate in peaceful direct action that can be creative and imaginative. And I think that as a tactic against a violent society, like our government and colonialism is a violence-based structure. And I think that it's really, as a tactic, one of our few options for opposing what's happening. And I also feel on a philosophical level myself that nonviolence is a way to really shift ourselves as people and to also shift our opponent. I think it has almost a magical quality, maybe because it's based in love or something, where, when I've seen this in different situations, where if you come to your opponent with respect and love and being open to the idea that this person or these people can change their perspective and, may eventually be able to see the wisdom in, say, saving old growth forest or whatever the topic may be. I think there's a real power in that. Beyond it just being a tactic, I think it can really transform people. And it's really exciting to see what's happened down at Fairy Creek in the last few years, where it really feels like it was, or is, a reboot of what happened here in 1993. And there comes a point where when you step outside the structures, anything can happen, like the possibilities. If you stay within the frame of patriarchy and colonialism, you're kind of bound by what is available within that frame. But when you step into a frame of nonviolence and peaceful action and a world of equality, I think, more becomes possible, more energies become available to us. And I think this is what we've seen happen at Fairy Creek. And it doesn't mean to say that everything is all unicorns and rainbows, because, all of us as individuals come to these movements as, we've all been through trauma to one extent or another. And most most mainstream societies aren't really teaching communication skills. And, there can be a lot of hurt and trauma and pain within these movements. But I think that when we participate in them, we stretch ourselves, and we really, like, each time we do it, we move towards being more and more powerful. And, I see that happening there. We participated in the blockades that happened up on Burnaby Mountain in 2014 to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And we saw very similar things happening there. So I I think it's a really important key to moving forward and really changing the structures that we're facing.
I think so much of what you said is so true and is really just well stated. And it makes me think of what Gandhi called his movement, Satyagraha, the force of truth. Truth is that we are all human, and to not deny another's humanity, to open the door for it, actually, is, like you said, the antithesis to patriarchy, but it also gives them the chance to be better, to do better, to see you as you're choosing to see them. And we see evidence of the power of it over and over again, not just with Gandhi and with Martin Luther King, but with these movements in Canada, with movements going on in India right now with the farmers who have, just as of late last year, knocked down these terribly exploitative farming and agriculture bills in a very powerful economy with hugely powerful interests. And I don't know, I think you're so right that if we can see outside of the framework of this system which has encouraged us to be exploitative or coercive or violent in some way, and we open our minds to other tactics based on compassion and truth, the truth of what that's at the core of all of us, anything's possible. Yeah, thank you for that.
I think, for myself as an activist, I was really lucky to come across Joanna Macy when I was in my 20s. She's a Buddhist writer and philosopher. And I learned from her writings and teachings at that time just the idea of being a lifelong activist. Because sometimes what happens is we throw ourselves into these struggles and we think this is it. I'm going to go to this blockade in 1993, or I'm going to go to Fairy Creek, or Black Lives Matter, or whatever. You throw yourself wholly into it. And, it's really takes a lot out of you. And I think I really realized through her teachings that it's important to nurture ourselves and look after ourselves, and to know when to step up and to know when to step back. And that this project that we're involved in, each of us in our own regions and our different ways around the world, it's a lifetime affair. It's not something that we're going to have happen overnight. It's a process, and it's going to take time. It's going to take generations. So I think that's something that's really important as well in terms of the sustainability of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you also make another really good point as far as this idea that activism doesn't have to be combative. It doesn't have to be a head-to-head sort of versus situation. You can choose as an activist to actually inhabit a space that's incredibly peaceful, and it's firm, it's persistent, it's connected to a truth that you feel within yourself, but it doesn't have to be this, chaotic sort of, I think the word activism even sort of calls to mind images of, fighting and the 1960s and police versus protester. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be very much more human and human to human, and those who are representing the interests of the sort of power structures, when given the chance to recognize their humanity, you never know what can happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Joanna Macy talks about there being different areas of involvement. So she talks about, holding actions for Mother Earth. So I feel like that's where I've spent a lot of my life. And this is important because when when the Great Transition happens, well, she also talks about the Great Unraveling, or the Great Turning. And so we're hoping for the Great Turning. We're working towards that, towards a more just world. And she talks about holding actions on behalf of Mother Earth, about building alternative institutions, and about a spiritual revolution. So in terms of what you're saying, there are people who may be working in the realm of spirit, and people who may work in the realm of alternative institutions. Like these farmers, they are on the front line as well, but people who are seed saving and growing food locally and, working on transition town and these type of things, it's very, very important. At the same time, there need to be people doing what Clayoquot Action is doing, and many others around the world, is actually trying to preserve wild areas so that they survive into the future and help create a healthy environment for everyone.
So my first question as we wrap up is, how can people support Clayoquot Action, and organizations like it? What guidance would you give to folks who want to get involved with these conversations, either where they are locally or to reach out to Clayoquot Action itself and support the work that you're doing?
Well, definitely people can look at our website, clayoquotaction.org. And, I think the big thing is it's important to support organizations like ours financially. And I think a lot of times I talk to people and they're like, oh, we're going to give money to this, huge organization that works for the environment. But I think it's important for people to realize if they do have the means to support organizations financially, to look at doing so towards grassroots organizations that are more or less, working on the front lines, whether it be indigenous or non-indigenous organizations or whatever realm it is. But a lot of these organizations are underfunded, and it's really important to get those individual donations to support the work of organizations like ours. So that would be, one thing. And then, of course, we always have, a petition, a letter signing tool on our website that people can participate in, and sharing on social media what's happening with the issue, and, getting conversations going with your friends and family about what's happening. Even like getting together and watching a video together or that kind of thing. Locally, if you're here locally in Tofino, we do have volunteer opportunities as well. So those are some of the ways that people can support.
Something you said reminded me of a Jane Goodall quote I came across recently, which is that when we think about the global scale, it's easy to get depressed and overwhelmed. But if we work at the local scale, we can see the result of our actions. We can build community. We can often turn the tide much more quickly in a way that's more sort of material to us. And I think a lot of the time we want to support these huge organizations like the Sierra Club or this or that because we think, oh, they're so big, they must be doing something. But actually, the local change is probably much more tangible and immediate for us if we can remember to support grassroots organizations like you're saying. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations at the level of Sierra Club, not to call them out individually, but they can be tied to politics and corporations, and there's unfortunately, opportunity at an organization that large to, muddy the waters a little bit, so to speak. But I think grassroots organizations are much closer to problems and a little more immune to interests for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And we have the added layer that we're not a charitable organization, so we can be really out there with our advocacy. We don't have to moderate it based on keeping our charitable number so that we can still get grants. And we can't get grants from a lot of foundations because we aren't charitable. So, I think for the most part, if you're donating to grassroots organizations, you're probably getting much more bang for your buck. Because when you don't have a lot of money, you really stretch those dollars. So,
yeah, I think that's a great point and a really good guidance.
But I think too that everybody has a different gift to offer, a different skill, and that's one thing is if people bring forward, just imagine what you could do and bring forward, music or art or there's different ways to participate in movements and to help build awareness. So people really can think about what their areas of passion are, their areas of skill, and bring those forward to your local movement.
Especially now with technology. I mean, we could put on virtual concerts in collaboration with musicians and sound producers of different kinds to raise money for different causes. There's so much we can do through technology now. One benefit of the pandemic may have shown us that some of our digital avenues are really compelling and we can really get creative with them and do a lot of good. So,
absolutely.
I think my last question to you would be, from where you sit, Bonny, and what you've observed and learned, and we've spoken about it a bit, but I'd love to just ask you to encapsulate it a bit. What would you say to people of any age, of any generation, who want to be part of these conversations to conserve, to protect, to ally with this idea of interconnectedness and respect for nature, for other humans? What guidance would you give as far as, what to build into your life to join these conversations and to make meaningful impact?
Well, I think the big thing is just wade in the water, wade in, and like history is like a river that's passing us by. And I think the important thing that I've learned in my life is just step in that water and, you will influence the current of history. And looking back, I actually just turned 59, and looking back on my life, it's wonderful to look up at the valleys of Clayoquot Sound and realize I made a change, I made a difference, And I think that's a pretty big difference to make. But I think that we can all make some amount of change and difference in our world, but we do have to step into that river, and sometimes that can be a bit scary, but it's definitely worth it, and it's definitely fulfilling.
I love that. One last question, did you ever see yourself as an activist when you were younger? Is this something that, did you always anticipate this path for yourself, or was it a bit of a surprise as you got involved?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe hard to say in hindsight.
I think I can look back now and sort of see, in my late teens, that there was an awakening happening to the injustice of the world, and something about my personality just took me down that path in my early 20s. And I tried to, have other careers and do other things, but I seem to always circle back to, pretty direct involvement in trying to make a difference in the world.
Yeah, and I love what you just shared about, you've protected your home, in a sense. You can look around where you are and say, I am part of the fabric of this place. I helped to ensure that this view that I have will be shared by people after me. And what a powerful and beautiful thing to be able to say. Mm-hmm. And I hope that more and more of us will be able to reach any age and be able to say that same thing.
Absolutely.
So, wonderful. Thanks so much, Bonny, for your time and for, your insight, your experience. I really appreciate you sharing it with us. There's a core question in this conversation, if you ask me. A question we need to ask and answer. Who owns nature? Who decides what happens to it? Historically, and in the recent past, it seems like governments say that they have the right to grant rights to corporations to harvest resources, to use the term that the market uses to describe natural living things which have market value, reducing them to a commodity, essentially. In other words, to take something from nature while giving nothing in return in order to turn what has been harvested into profit. But how can a government give itself the power to grant corporations the right to take these trees, these minerals from mountains, these waters from under the ground, as though the government itself owns nature? Indigenous voices are calling out for recognition of the stewardship responsibility they feel for their own ancestral lands as an answer to this question. And alongside those voices, activists and conservationists are calling out for a recognition that nature cannot be destroyed for profit without end, considering the cost of the impact on climate and ecosystems, the loss of species, the mass extinction going on around the globe due to the destruction of these ecosystems, and the loss of the human access and relationship to these natural places. How is it that governments decide something that we all share and benefit from? Especially at a time when many voices and organizations around the world are calling for the formulation of a new Bill of Rights for all living beings, including the Earth. Isn't clear-cutting an ancient forest with thousands of endangered species a textbook definition of a massive violation of the rights of those individual beings? Who owns nature? Who gets to decide what happens? We don't get to sit back and ponder this question for too much longer because governments and corporations are continuously moving in. And as long as the rest of us stay out of the conversation, they essentially just do what they want. And we're reaching a tipping point where the consequences of those actions are going to be irreversible. I think it's crucial at this time, and definitely this year, to get involved in conversations like this one and to add our voices to them. Which brings us to our changemakers for today, the 3 ideas that could change the world if we adopt them, inspired by our guest. Changemaker number 1. It's time to re-examine protesting as a tool and bring it back to the foreground. Our governments and the corporations we share the world with have not made any meaningful improvements to their approach to conservation and sustainability and protecting the health of the planet in the long term that I think any of us can see clearly. There are commitments made, there are treaties signed, there are global summits to discuss these issues, but it's a lot of talk and not a lot of meaningful action. It seems like protesting and these community movements with direct action involved do work. And at a certain point, we have to say, enough, stop. We need to examine this. We need a larger discussion. Direct action works. Maybe it's time to make protesting and physical direct action more a part of our day-to-day experience to make our voices heard. Which leads us to changemaker number 2. Communities coming together peacefully may be the most powerful force for change on Earth, and the most historically successful. What else has launched the world into justice-based progress, like movements of peaceful protest, built on persistence, built on consistency, with a desire for social and economic justice? I don't think I can think of anything else that has really moved the needle for civil rights of any kind, except communities coming together and peacefully protesting, peacefully resisting civil disobedience. It worked for Gandhi. It worked for the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century. It worked for Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in America in the 1960s. And it has been somewhat successful in Western Canada. We've seen results come from these protests. Even if on the ground the logging continues, a lot of conversations have been started because of this massive attention brought to a group of people who refuse to be complicit in the actions of a few. Gandhi called his movement Satyagraha, the force of truth. Gandhi believed in the power of deeper truths. And if we believe in that power as well, these values, these ideas could shape global movements to halt progress in the name of profit and begin a new conversation around what really matches who we are now and where we want to go as a planetary community. And changemaker number 3, it's time to get involved now. I'm starting to believe that if we don't consider ourselves activists for some cause, then we're disconnected from what's happening in the world. Our world needs us to shape it. I would love to see 2022 become the year of the activist, where each of us becomes an activist for something that we believe in, that we care about. I think many of us are already answering this call because the world is becoming very concerning in many ways, and so we are digging in. We are realizing that the direction that we're on won't shift without our say-so, without our direct involvement. Let's get together, build movements, and take action that cannot be ignored. Let's learn from past examples and explore the tools available to us, and let's get serious about the world that we want to build. Here's what you can do today. You can start by learning more about Clayoquot Action specifically. Become familiar with Clayoquot Action and other organizations like it in the area and their philosophies, their methods, the issues they care about, and their relationship to the lands and the peoples around them. Begin to understand why grassroots organizations like Clayoquot Action are worth supporting or joining if you can. Check out the Beautiful Trouble website as well, which Bonny told us about. It is an amazing library of resources which shows how a movement can be built, which shows how a protest can be built. It's got educational resources about the legal ins and outs of building a protest, building non-violent resistance and civil disobedience movements. It has examples of successes from movements all around the world. It's really an amazing resource. I'm so glad Bonny told me about it, because I think I may have heard about it in the past, but for some reason I'd never really spent time looking at it. And I am so excited to dig deeper, because I have only spent a little bit of time on it and was already majorly impressed. So check out the Beautiful Trouble website. Maybe it'll inspire something within you. Here's our challenge for you today. Pick 3 issues that you care about and find a grassroots organization doing work that resonates with you and learn about them. Choose to support these grassroots organizations in some way if you can, by donating if you're able, by volunteering if that's an option, or simply by sharing their message with other people that you're familiar with. I would venture to say that just about every single urban center in the world has at least a few grassroots nonprofits who are doing amazing, difficult, inspiring work. So pick a few topics that resonate with you, that you're passionate about, and find those organizations, either in your area or in a city that you love. And then do what you can to understand their mission more. Share it, support it, whatever feels right to you. Get involved. If you'd like to support Bonny and Clayoquot Action, check out clayoquotaction.org, ClayOuTACtion.org, to check out the work and programs that they are focused on right now, especially as it relates to the conservation of wild salmon in that area, which is so important right now. Bonny's right that that ecosystem is on the brink of collapse if we don't do something to prevent corporate interest from disrupting something that has been working for thousands of years. If you feel moved, support Clayoquot Action by donating to their efforts. Volunteer if you're local in the British Columbia area. Sign their petitions, make your voice known to support their voice, and share with people you know, whether they're interested in topics like this or not. Start these conversations in your circle. We've said it often already this year, but it really feels like 2022 is a moment we will not get back. This is the time to mobilize, to learn from every source that technology gives us as far as what's happening in the world, on the ground, beyond the official story that we're given, and to take the opportunity to see the corporate and governmental structures that work against human rights and planetary rights for what they are, and to see that there is change that we can make, that we can do something about it. We can organize, we can build communities, we can build movements. We can find those who are in our tribe, who agree with us, whatever our beliefs or values are. Join protests, start protests, learn about civil disobedience, the tactics, the history, the successes, the important points to be aware of, and what your version of it might look like. Just as there are countless problems to solve and challenges to overcome, there are countless approaches to take. There's no one right way for the solution to anything. So start asking yourself, what is my version of getting involved? How can I lend my voice to support nature, to support wildlife, to support people in need? And then give yourself the opportunity to get involved, to experience that feeling of direct action, to get closer to what Bonny shared as far as looking around at the nature, the ecosystem, the trees, the waters around her, and to be able to say, I am part of the fabric of this place. I have done something to protect it. What an amazing thing to be able to say. And my hope is that every one of us by the end of this year in some way will be able to say, we have done something to protect what matters to us this year. Join us in a couple weeks for our next episode. We'll be speaking with singer-songwriter Aurora, who is a huge inspiration to me. She's made a huge splash on the global music scene, and she is very outspoken about her passion for nature and protecting it. And she believes very much that each one of us has a small part to play in making this world a better place, and that we all have the opportunity to do so every day. Join us, it's really a great conversation. Be well, be safe, and remember that this game isn't over yet. There's still so much good that can come out of these challenges, and you can be part of it now if you choose to be. Until next time.